The fluorescent lights of Meadowview Psychiatric Center buzzed overhead as I stood in the discharge lounge, clutching a manila envelope containing my release papers and 3 weeks' worth of hard-won progress. Around me, other patients were being greeted by family members with warm embraces, gentle words, and promises that things would be different now. Children ran to grandparents, spouses held each other tight, siblings offered reassuring smiles that said, "Welcome back to the world." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But I stood alone by the window, watching the parking lot, for a silver Honda that was now 45 minutes late. My son Marcus had promised to pick me up at 2 o'clock. He'd said it with the same tone he used when scheduling business meetings, efficient and detached, like my mental health recovery was just another item on his calendar that he'd rather delegate to someone else. When the Honda finally pulled up, Marcus didn't even turn off the engine. He sat behind the wheel in his charcoal business suit, sunglasses on despite the cloudy October afternoon, phone pressed to his ear in what appeared to be an important call that couldn't wait for his mother's discharge from psychiatric care. The trunk popped open with an electronic click, his way of telling me to hurry up and load my bag myself. During the 20-minute drive to my duplex, Marcus spoke exactly once. "Dr. Patterson says you're doing better," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that required no response. The radio filled the silence between us, some talk show host discussing market trends that Marcus seemed far more interested in than his mother's well-being. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined as he dropped me off like an inconvenient package, was that tucked inside my purse was a quarterly investment statement that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about his embarrassing, unstable mother. 28 years of strategic planning, careful saving, and calculated risks had built something extraordinary. Something that would make his corporate salary look like pocket money. Something that was about to teach him the most expensive lesson about respect he'd ever receive. My name is Hazel Norton, and I wasn't always the woman standing in that duplex doorway, watching her son drive away without so much as a goodbye wave. There was a time when Marcus looked at me like I was his whole world, when my approval mattered, more than anything else in his universe, when we shared dreams and secrets and the kind of bond that I believed nothing could break. I was 22 when Marcus entered my life, older than some new mothers but still young enough to feel completely overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a human being. His father, David, had been my college sweetheart, the kind of man who made grand romantic gestures and bigger promises about our future together. "We were going to travel the world," he said. "We were going to build something amazing together." Instead, when I told him I was pregnant during our senior year, David's grand promises evaporated like morning mist. He transferred to a school across the country and left me with nothing but a forwarding address I never used and a growing belly that represented both my greatest fear and my deepest joy. My parents tried to be supportive, but their version of support came wrapped in judgment and barely concealed disappointment. "You could still go to graduate school," my mother would say, her voice heavy with the weight of dreams she felt I was abandoning. "You could still have a career. Don't let this derail your whole life." But looking at the ultrasound pictures taped to my refrigerator, watching that tiny form grow and develop, I didn't feel derailed. I felt redirected toward something more important than any career I'd imagined. Marcus was born on a snowy February morning, 6 pounds 12 ounces of perfect possibility. The moment they placed him in my arms, his tiny fingers wrapping around mine with surprising strength, I understood what love actually meant. It wasn't the butterflies in your stomach feeling I'd had with David. It was deeper, more primal, a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. "I will never let you down," I whispered to my sleeping son. "I will be everything you need, even if I have to figure out what that means along the way." Those early months were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and stays there. But they were also filled with small miracles. Marcus's first smile, the way he'd calm down instantly when I sang to him, the perfect weight of him sleeping on my chest while I read textbooks for the online classes I was taking to finish my degree. My parents helped when they could, but they were still hoping I'd come to my senses and make different choices. I finished my bachelor's degree in business administration when Marcus was 18 months old, taking classes online while he napped and staying up late to write papers after he'd gone to bed. It wasn't the college experience I'd originally planned, but watching him take his first steps across the stage where I'd eventually walk to receive my diploma made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Finding work as a single mother was more challenging than I'd anticipated. Many employers seemed skeptical about my ability to commit to a job when I had a toddler at home. But I finally found a position at a small accounting firm downtown, working for a woman named Eleanor Webb who had raised 3 children as a single mother herself. Eleanor understood that sometimes I'd need to leave early for doctor's appointments or stay home with a sick child, and she offered flexibility in exchange for dedication and hard work. Marcus thrived in daycare, a bright and curious child who made friends easily and seemed to absorb new information like a sponge. His teachers consistently told me how advanced he was, how well-behaved, how much they enjoyed having him in their classroom. I'd pick him up each evening and listen to his excited chatter about what he'd learned, what games he'd played, which friends had shared their snacks with him. Those car rides home were some of my favorite parts of each day. Evenings were our special time together. I'd cook dinner while Marcus sat at the kitchen table with coloring books or puzzles, telling me elaborate stories about his imaginary adventures. After dinner, we'd read together on the couch, his small body curled against mine as we explored distant lands and magical kingdoms through picture books that we checked out from the library every week. Bath time was filled with splashing and laughter, bedtime with lullabies and whispered stories about brave princes and clever princesses who always found ways to solve their problems. As Marcus grew older, our routine evolved, but the closeness remained. Elementary school brought homework sessions at the kitchen table, where I'd help him with math problems while reviewing financial reports for my job. We'd work side by side, encouraging each other through difficult tasks, celebrating small victories with high fives and special treats. Marcus showed an early aptitude for mathematics and science, subjects that came naturally to him but required more effort from me. I'd spend evenings researching concepts I'd forgotten since college, watching online tutorials so I could help him with increasingly complex assignments. When he expressed interest in joining the robotics club in 4th grade, I worked overtime to afford the participation fees and spent weekends driving him to competitions where I cheered from the sidelines as his team's creations performed tasks I barely understood. It was during those elementary school years that I first became seriously interested in investing. Eleanor had been encouraging her employees to contribute to retirement accounts, and she'd sometimes share articles about financial planning during our lunch breaks. Initially, I felt like investing was something for people with disposable income, people who didn't have to choose between buying groceries and paying for their child's school supplies. But the more I learned, the more I realized that investing, small amounts consistently over time, could grow into something substantial. I started with $25 a month, money I scraped together by packing lunches instead of buying them, by cutting coupons and shopping sales, by finding small ways to trim expenses without affecting Marcus's needs or opportunities. I researched companies obsessively, reading annual reports and financial news with the same intensity that Marcus brought to his science projects. Eleanor noticed my interest and began sharing more advanced resources, lending me books about investment, strategies, and market analysis. When Marcus was in 6th grade, I made my first significant investment decision. A technology company I'd been following was developing software that seemed revolutionary, and their stock price had dropped due to some temporary setbacks that I believed the market was overreacting to. I invested $500, money I'd saved from a small raise and some freelance bookkeeping work I'd taken on. 6 months later, that investment had doubled. I was hooked. Middle school brought new challenges and opportunities for Marcus. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was accepted into the accelerated math program, joined the debate team, and started talking about wanting to attend a prestigious high school that would position him well for college admissions. The school he wanted to attend was private, expensive, and exactly the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed of providing for him. I worked with Eleanor to develop a more sophisticated investment strategy, diversifying across different sectors while focusing on companies with strong growth potential. I read everything I could find about market trends, economic indicators, and long-term wealth building. My lunch breaks were spent poring over financial magazines and investment websites. My evenings, after Marcus had gone to bed, were dedicated to research and analysis that felt like solving puzzles with potentially life-changing solutions. By the time Marcus started high school at the prestigious academy we'd chosen together, my investment portfolio had grown to something substantial enough to pay his tuition without touching my regular income, but I never told him how I was managing the expenses. I wanted him to focus on his education and opportunities without worrying about the financial sacrifices I was making to provide them. High school Marcus was everything I'd hoped he would become. He excelled academically, was elected to student government, and developed leadership skills that made his teachers consistently praise his potential. He talked about attending law school, following his interest in constitutional law and civil rights. He volunteered at legal aid clinics on weekends, participated in mock trial competitions, and wrote papers about social justice that made me incredibly proud of the young man he was becoming. During his junior year, Marcus started dating Sarah Chen, a brilliant girl from a wealthy family who shared his academic ambitions and social consciousness. Sarah was lovely, polite to me, and clearly cared about Marcus in ways that made me hopeful about his future happiness. Her parents were both successful professionals, doctors who lived in a mansion across town and seemed to embody the kind of life Marcus was working toward. That's when I first noticed the subtle shift in how Marcus saw our life together. When Sarah would come for dinner, I'd catch him glancing around our modest duplex with what looked like embarrassment. He'd apologize for the outdated furniture, make excuses for the small kitchen, and seem relieved when they'd leave for activities at her family's house instead. "Mom," he said one evening after Sarah had gone home, "do you ever think about moving to a nicer place? Maybe something more, I don't know, impressive?" I looked around our duplex, seeing it through his eyes for the first time in years. The furniture was indeed outdated, purchased secondhand when he was small and never replaced because it was functional, and I'd been prioritizing his education expenses and my investment contributions. The kitchen was tiny, the carpet showed its age, and the whole place probably looked shabby compared to Sarah's family's home. "Do you think where we live reflects poorly on you?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Marcus backtracked quickly, assuring me that he wasn't embarrassed, that he understood I was doing my best as a single mother. But the conversation planted a seed of awareness that would grow over the following months. Marcus had developed tastes and expectations that my visible lifestyle couldn't support, and he was beginning to see our home as a limitation rather than the foundation that had enabled his success. College applications dominated Marcus's senior year, and I was thrilled when he was accepted to his first choice, a prestigious university with an excellent pre-law program. The tuition and expenses were staggering, more than I made in a year, at the accounting firm. But my investment portfolio had grown substantially. I could afford to send him without taking on debt, though I'd have to liquidate some positions and adjust my strategy. When I told Marcus that I could cover his college expenses, he seemed surprised and relieved, but he didn't ask how I was managing it. I think he assumed I'd been saving small amounts for years, maybe received some financial aid, or was planning to take on debt that he didn't want to think about. The idea that his mother might have built substantial wealth through savvy investing probably never occurred to him. College transformed Marcus in ways I'd anticipated and ways I hadn't. Academically, he flourished, making Dean's List consistently and impressing his professors with research projects that earned him opportunities to assist with their published work. Socially, he joined a fraternity, participated in student government, and developed friendships with classmates from backgrounds much more privileged than ours. During his sophomore year, Marcus brought a fraternity brother home for Thanksgiving break. Jeremy was from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for generations, and carried themselves with the unconscious confidence that comes from never having worried about money. He was polite to me, but in the way that people are polite to service workers, friendly but distant, clearly seeing me as part of Marcus's past rather than his future. That weekend, I overheard Jeremy ask Marcus about his family situation, using the kind of delicate language that indicated he'd been briefed on my single mother status. Marcus's response was measured, defensive, and carefully crafted to minimize the circumstances of his upbringing while emphasizing his own achievements and potential. "My mom worked really hard to give me opportunities," Marcus said, which was true but seemed to cast me in the role of struggling sacrifice rather than successful provider. "I'm pretty much paying my own way through school now," which was completely false, but apparently made him feel more independent and self-sufficient in Jeremy's eyes. I didn't correct him, but the conversation stung in ways I hadn't expected. Marcus was rewriting our story, minimizing my role in his success, and creating distance between his current life and the foundation that had made it possible. I understood the impulse, the desire to be seen as self-made rather than supported, but it hurt to be erased from the narrative of his achievements. Law school brought more of the same. Marcus was accepted to an excellent program, and I continued, covering his expenses while my investment portfolio grew through increasingly sophisticated strategies I'd developed over the years. I'd moved beyond simple stock picking to options trading, real estate investment trusts, and international funds that required constant monitoring and analysis. But Marcus seemed to grow more distant with each semester. Our phone calls became shorter and less frequent. His visits home were brief and felt obligatory. When he talked about his classmates and their families, I could hear the longing in his voice for connections that represented the kind of social status he aspired to, rather than the love and support he'd always known. The final shift came during Marcus's last year of law school, when he landed a prestigious internship at a corporate firm in the city. The other interns came from families with connections, wealth, and social standing that Marcus desperately wanted to claim for himself. He started talking about his background in increasingly vague terms, describing me as working in finance rather than at a small accounting firm, mentioning our family investments without acknowledging that those investments were entirely my doing. When Marcus graduated from law school and accepted a position at a top-tier firm, I was overwhelmed with pride. My son, the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I balanced checkbooks and researched stock picks, was going to be a successful attorney. He was going to have the security and respect and opportunities that I'd dreamed of providing for him. But success changed Marcus in ways I hadn't anticipated. The job came with long hours, demanding clients, and social expectations that seemed to require distancing himself from anything that might be perceived as unsophisticated or limiting. Our conversations became stilted, focused on surface-level topics that didn't require him to acknowledge the depth of our shared history or the sacrifices that had made his success possible. I continued investing, growing my portfolio into something that would have shocked Marcus if he'd known about it. But I lived modestly, driving an older car and maintaining our duplex rather than upgrading to something more impressive. I wanted my wealth to be strategic, purposeful, available for opportunities that mattered rather than visible for show. What I didn't realize was that Marcus had begun to see my modest lifestyle as a reflection of limited resources rather than deliberate choices. He'd started to view me as someone who needed to be managed rather than honored, someone whose presence in his new social circles might undermine the image he was carefully constructing. The distance between us grew slowly, so gradually that I didn't recognize it as abandonment until it was too late. Marcus was building a life that had no room for the woman who had made it possible, and I was about to learn just how completely he was willing to erase me from his story. I just had no idea yet how expensive that lesson would be for both of us. The first crack in our relationship appeared on a humid Thursday evening in June, 3 months after Marcus had started his position at Whitman, Sterling & Associates. I'd driven into the city to attend his firm's summer associate reception, an event he'd mentioned casually during one of our increasingly brief phone calls. When I'd asked if family members were invited, there'd been a pause long enough to make my stomach clench before he said, "I suppose you could come if you really want to." I'd spent 2 weeks preparing for that evening, purchasing a navy dress. That was more expensive than anything I'd worn in years, getting my hair styled at a salon instead of trimming it myself, and researching the firm online so I could make intelligent conversation about their recent cases and achievements. I wanted Marcus to be proud to introduce me to his colleagues, to show them that his mother was sophisticated and engaged, worthy of the son they were getting to know. The reception was held at the Georgian Terrace Hotel, a grand old building, downtown with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that spoke of old money and established power. I arrived fashionably late, as my research had suggested was appropriate for such events, and spent a few minutes in the ladies' room checking my appearance and practicing conversation starters that would demonstrate my knowledge of current legal issues. When I entered the ballroom, I spotted Marcus immediately. He was standing with a group of young attorneys, all of them holding crystal glasses of what looked like expensive wine, all of them dressed in suits that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Marcus looked polished and confident, gesturing as he told some story that was making the others laugh. For a moment, I felt that familiar surge of pride watching my son hold his own among these accomplished people. I approached their group with a smile, ready to be introduced as Marcus's mother, the woman who had supported his journey to this impressive moment. But when Marcus saw me walking toward them, his expression changed in a way that made my steps falter. It wasn't joy or pride or even simple acknowledgement. It was panic, followed quickly by resignation, the look of someone whose carefully constructed facade was about to be exposed. "Marcus," I said warmly when I reached their circle, "this must be some of your colleagues." The pause that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt endless. Marcus's jaw tensed almost imperceptibly before he managed a tight smile. "Everyone, this is Hazel Norton," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth I'd expected. "Hazel, these are some of the other associates from the firm. Hazel, not my mother, not the woman who raised me. Just Hazel, as if I were some family friend or distant acquaintance who'd happened to show up at his professional event." The omission hit me like a physical blow, but I kept smiling, extending my hand to shake with each of the young lawyers as they introduced themselves with the easy confidence of people accustomed to such gatherings. "How do you know Marcus?" asked a blonde woman named Victoria, her tone polite but clearly curious about this older woman who'd appeared in their social circle. Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in. "Hazel is from my hometown," he said smoothly. "She's been very supportive of my career." Supportive? As if I were a mentor or family friend rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything to make his career possible. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I maintained my composure, making appropriate small talk about the firm and the city, while Marcus grew increasingly tense beside me. The conversation eventually moved to discussion of summer vacation, plans, and I listened as these young attorneys talked about trips to Europe, family compounds in the Hamptons, and sailing excursions that cost more than most people made in a year. When Victoria mentioned that her family always spent August at their house on Martha's Vineyard, Marcus nodded as if such experiences were completely familiar to him. "What about you, Marcus?" asked a tall young man named Bradley. "Any exciting summer plans?" Marcus glanced at me quickly before answering. I'm thinking about renting a place in the Outer Banks for a week or two, he said. Somewhere quiet to decompress from the intensity of starting at the firm. I knew for a fact that Marcus had no such plans and no budget for expensive vacation rentals, but I said nothing. I was beginning to understand that my presence was creating a problem he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to navigate between the truth of his background and the image he was trying to project to his new colleagues. When the conversation turned to family backgrounds, as such conversations inevitably do among young professionals trying to establish their social credentials, Marcus became even more uncomfortable. Bradley mentioned that his father was a federal judge, Victoria's family owned a chain of luxury hotels, and another associate talked about growing up on a cattle ranch that had been in his family for generations. "What about your family, Marcus?" Victoria asked. "You've been pretty mysterious about your background." Marcus took a long sip of his wine before answering. "My family is pretty private," he said. "My mother works in financial services, does quite well for herself. I was fortunate to have opportunities growing up." Financial services. It was technically true, but so stripped of context that it might as well have been a lie. I worked at a small accounting firm, not some prestigious investment bank. I'd built my portfolio through careful research and strategic risk-taking, not through family connections or inherited wealth. And the opportunities Marcus had grown up with existed because I'd worked overtime and lived modestly to provide them, not because we'd been born into privilege. But correcting him would have embarrassed him in front of his colleagues, and despite the growing hurt I was feeling, I wasn't willing to undermine him professionally. So I smiled and nodded when Victoria commented that financial services was such an interesting field, and I made vague responses to questions about market trends and investment strategies. The evening continued with more conversations that required Marcus to perform a version of himself that had no room for the truth of our shared history. When someone mentioned attending boarding school, Marcus talked about the rigorous academic environment of his high school, without mentioning that it was the result of my research and financial sacrifice. When the conversation turned to college experiences, he spoke about his achievements and opportunities without acknowledging the support system that had made them possible. By the time the reception ended, I felt exhausted from watching my son pretend I didn't exist in any meaningful way. As we walked to the parking garage together, I finally asked the question that had been building all evening. "Marcus, why didn't you introduce me as your mother?" He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression a mixture of frustration and something that looked almost like shame. "Mom, you don't understand the dynamics here. These people, they come from a certain kind of background. They have expectations about what? About the kind of people who belong in their world? It's not that simple," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and looked around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "This job, this firm, it's about more than just legal skills. It's about fitting in, about projecting the right image. These people don't just hire lawyers, they hire representatives of their brand. And you think I would damage that brand?" Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was trying to work through a difficult problem. "I think that my colleagues don't need to know every detail of my personal life. I think that professional relationships work better when they're kept separate from family complications." Family complications. That's what I had become to him. Not the foundation of his success, not the woman who had loved and supported him unconditionally, but a complication that threatened his carefully constructed professional image. We drove home in silence, Marcus following my car back to the duplex in his sleek sedan that cost more than I'd made in 2 years at the accounting firm. When we arrived, he came inside for what I hoped would be a real conversation about what had happened that evening, but he seemed distracted and eager to leave. "I should get back to the city," he said, after accepting a glass of water and declining my offer to make coffee. "Early morning tomorrow. Big case briefing." "Marcus," I said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations over the years. I need you to help me understand what's happening between us. He looked up from his phone, which he'd been checking constantly since we'd arrived. What do you mean? I mean that tonight, at your firm's reception, you treated me like a stranger. You introduced me by my first name. You talked about me. Like I was some distant family friend, and you seemed embarrassed that I was there at all. Marcus set down his phone and met my eyes for the first time all evening. Mom, you're being overly sensitive. I introduced you to my colleagues. I included you in conversations. I don't understand what more you wanted. I wanted you to acknowledge that I'm your mother. I wanted you to be proud of me, the way I've always been proud of you. Of course I'm proud of you, Marcus said, but his tone was tired, like he was humoring an unreasonable child. You've worked hard, you've done well for yourself, you gave me opportunities. I appreciate all of that. Then why do you seem embarrassed by me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. Mom, you have to understand that my colleagues and we inhabit a certain kind of world now. The way we dress, the places we go, the conversations we have, it's all different from this. He gestured around our modest kitchen with its outdated appliances and secondhand furniture. This is where you grew up, I said quietly. This is the home that made your success possible. And I'm grateful for that, Marcus said quickly. But that doesn't mean I want to broadcast my humble beginnings to people who might see them as a limitation rather than a strength. Humble beginnings, as if love and sacrifice and careful planning were something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. As if the foundation that had enabled his success was somehow inferior to inherited privilege. That night, after Marcus had driven back to his expensive apartment in the city, I sat in our kitchen and tried to understand when my son had started seeing our life together as something to overcome rather than something to honor. I tried to trace the evolution from the boy who used to brag to his friends about his mom's cooking to the man who couldn't acknowledge me as his mother in front of his colleagues. The calls became even less frequent after that evening. When Marcus did phone, our conversations were superficial, focused on safe topics like weather and work projects that didn't require him to engage with me as a person with feelings and needs. I started to feel like I was being managed rather than loved, like he was checking in out of obligation rather than genuine interest in my well-being. 3 months later, Marcus called with news that should have thrilled me. He'd been invited to join a prestigious young professionals organization, a social and networking group that included some of the most promising attorneys, doctors, and business leaders in the city. The membership was highly selective, he explained, and being accepted represented a significant step forward in his career trajectory. That's wonderful, I told him, and I meant it. Despite everything, I was still proud of his achievements, still invested in his success. There's going to be an induction ceremony next month, Marcus continued. It's pretty formal, black tie event at the country club. Family members are invited. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe this would be an opportunity to rebuild our connection, to be included in his world in a meaningful way. I'd love to come, I said. Another pause, shorter this time but still noticeable. The thing is, Mom, it's a pretty high-profile event. Lots of prominent families, city leaders, that kind of crowd. I want to make sure of what? Just that we're on the same page about how to handle the evening. You know, keeping things simple, not getting into too much detail about personal history. I felt that familiar cold sensation in my chest. Marcus, what exactly are you asking me to do? I'm not asking you to do anything except be yourself. I just think it might be better if we keep the focus on the present rather than dwelling on the past. You mean if I don't mention that I'm your mother? I mean if we don't get bogged down in family dynamics that might distract from the purpose of the evening. I was quiet for so long that Marcus finally asked if I was still there. I'm here, I said. I'm just trying to understand why you're so ashamed of me. I'm not ashamed of you, Marcus said, his voice carrying that edge of frustration that had become familiar in our conversations. I'm trying to protect both of us from uncomfortable situations. Uncomfortable for whom? For everyone involved. Mom, these people have certain expectations about the kinds of families that belong in their social circles. They're not bad people, but they have limited experience with backgrounds like ours. Backgrounds like ours, as if growing up with a single mother who worked multiple jobs and invested wisely was some kind of shameful secret rather than a story of determination and success. I declined the invitation to his induction ceremony. I told Marcus I had a work commitment I couldn't reschedule, which was true in the sense that I'd decided to schedule a work commitment rather than subject myself to another evening of being erased from my son's story. Marcus seemed relieved by my decision, which hurt more than his embarrassment had. The fact that my absence made his life easier, that my presence had become something he actively avoided rather than welcomed, forced me to confront a reality I'd been trying to deny. My son was no longer proud of me. Somewhere along the path, from childhood to professional success, I had transformed from his greatest champion into his greatest liability. The love and sacrifice that had defined our relationship for 25 years had been recast as limitations that threatened his advancement in a world that valued appearance over substance, connections over character. The invitations stopped, coming after that. Marcus would mention social events and professional gatherings in passing during our phone calls, but always as experiences he was navigating alone rather than opportunities we might share. I heard about dinner parties with senior partners, charity galas with city leaders, weekend retreats with influential clients, but always as stories told after the fact rather than invitations extended in advance. I started to realize that Marcus was living two completely separate lives. There was his professional and social life in the city, filled with people who knew him as a successful attorney from an appropriately prestigious background. And there was his family life, which consisted of obligatory phone calls with a mother he'd rather keep hidden from anyone who mattered to his future. The final break came 6 months later, during what should have been a celebration. Marcus had been offered a partnership track position at his firm, a remarkable achievement for someone so early in his career. When he called to share the news, I was genuinely thrilled for him. "Marcus, that's incredible," I said. "I'm so proud of you. This is everything you've worked for." "Thanks, Mom. It's pretty exciting. The partners seem really confident about my potential." "We should celebrate," I suggested. "Why don't I drive up to the city this weekend? I could take you to dinner somewhere special." The silence that followed was answer enough, but Marcus filled it anyway. "This weekend is pretty busy for me. The firm is having a celebration dinner for the new partnership track associates. And then there are some social obligations with colleagues." "Oh, what about the following weekend?" "Mom, the thing is, the next few months are going to be really intense. Making partner requires a lot of networking, relationship building, FaceTime with clients. I'm going to have to really focus on work." I understood what he was telling me. His success required distancing himself from me even further, minimizing our relationship to the point where it wouldn't interfere with his professional advancement. I was being gently but firmly excluded from the most important period of his career. "I see," I said quietly. "It's not personal," Marcus said quickly. "It's just the reality of how this business works. Family relationships can be complicated when you're trying to establish yourself professionally." "Complicated," I repeated. "You know what I mean. People make assumptions about your background, your qualifications, your fit with the firm culture. It's easier to control the narrative when you keep personal and professional spheres separate." Control the narrative. That's what I had become. To him, a narrative that needed to be controlled rather than a relationship that deserved to be honored. All those years of love and sacrifice and unwavering support had been reduced to a story that was better left untold. That conversation marked the beginning of what would become months of increasing isolation. Marcus's calls became even less frequent, and when he did phone, he seemed distracted and eager to end the conversation quickly. He stopped asking about my life, my work, my health, my interests. Our relationship became entirely one-sided, with me providing emotional support and encouragement for his career, while receiving nothing in return except the growing certainty that I was no longer welcome in his world. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, taking on additional clients and expanding my investment research into new sectors and strategies. My portfolio continued to grow substantially, but the financial success felt hollow without someone to share it with. I'd built wealth as a way of providing security and opportunities for Marcus, but he was no longer interested in being part of my life in any meaningful way. The stress of losing my son, combined with the long hours I was working to distract myself from the loneliness, began taking a toll on my physical and mental health. I started having trouble sleeping, waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning with anxiety that made it impossible to get back to rest. My appetite disappeared, and I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. Simple tasks that had never bothered me before, like grocery shopping or driving to work, began feeling overwhelming. I tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that Marcus was just going through a phase of establishing his independence and would eventually remember the importance of family. I told myself that his career demands were genuinely intense and that his distance wasn't personal. But deep down, I knew I was making excuses for behavior that had crossed the line from busy into cruel. The breaking point came on my 53rd birthday. I'd been hoping Marcus would remember, would call or visit or at least send a card acknowledging the day. But the phone never rang. No flowers were delivered. No messages appeared on my answering machine. For the first time in 25 years, my birthday passed without any acknowledgement from my son. I spent that evening sitting in our kitchen, looking at old photo albums filled with pictures of Marcus growing up. Birthday parties where he'd insisted on making me cards decorated with crayon drawings and stickers. Mother's Day celebrations where he'd serve me breakfast in bed, carefully balancing orange juice and toast on a tray he'd decorated with construction paper flowers. Christmas mornings when he'd been more excited about giving me presents than receiving them. The little boy in those photographs had loved me unconditionally, had been proud to call me his mother, had seen me as the center of his universe. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an embarrassment to be hidden rather than a foundation to be honored. That night, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I was done accepting crumbs of affection from someone I'd given everything to. I was done being treated like a shameful secret by the person I'd sacrificed everything for. And I was done pretending that Marcus's success was worth the price of my dignity and self-respect. But I had no idea yet how much that decision would cost both of us, or how completely it would transform our relationship in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The panic attack hit me on a Tuesday morning in September while I was reviewing quarterly reports for one of my investment accounts. I'd been tracking a pharmaceutical stock that was showing unusual volatility, something that normally would have triggered my analytical instincts and prompted deeper research. Instead, as I stared at the numbers on my computer screen, they began to blur and shift in ways that made no sense. My heart started racing first, a rapid pounding that seemed to echo in my ears and drown out the familiar sounds of the accounting office around me. Then came the sweating, cold perspiration that soaked through my blouse despite the air conditioning that kept our building consistently cool. My hands began to shake so violently that I couldn't hold my coffee cup steady, and when I tried to stand up from my desk, the room tilted sideways in a way that made me grab the edge of my workstation for support. "Hazel, are you all right?" Eleanor's voice seemed to come from very far away, though I could see her standing right beside my desk. "You look pale." I tried to answer, but when I opened my mouth, no words came out. Instead, I felt like I was suffocating, like the air in the room had suddenly become too thick to breathe. My chest felt tight, compressed, as if someone had wrapped bands around my ribs and was pulling them tighter and tighter with each attempted breath. Eleanor helped me to the small break room, her arm steady around my shoulders as I struggled to walk without stumbling. She guided me to a chair and brought me a glass of water, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold it without spilling. The water was cool against my lips, but it didn't help the sensation that I was drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people who couldn't see that I was struggling to stay afloat. "I think I need to go home," I managed to whisper when the worst of the shaking had subsided. Eleanor drove me to the duplex herself, insisting that I was in no condition to operate a vehicle. During the short ride, she kept glancing at me with concern, asking gentle questions about whether I'd been feeling stressed lately, whether I'd been sleeping well, whether there were any family issues she should know about. I answered with vague reassurances, not wanting to admit that my son had essentially erased me from his life, and that I'd been spiraling into a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. That evening, alone in the duplex that had once felt like a warm sanctuary but now felt like a monument to abandonment, I tried to convince myself that the panic attack was just a one-time occurrence. Stress from work, maybe, or too much caffeine, or some kind of hormonal fluctuation that would resolve itself with rest and proper nutrition. I made myself a simple dinner, took a hot bath, and went to bed early, certain that a good night's sleep would restore my equilibrium. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the darkness, listening to every sound the house made, every creak of settling wood and hum of aging appliances, feeling hyper-aware of my own heartbeat and breathing in ways that made relaxation impossible. When I finally did drift off, near dawn, I was awakened almost immediately by dreams that left me gasping and disoriented, unable to remember what had frightened me, but certain that something terrible was lurking just beyond my conscious awareness. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Panic attacks would strike without warning, sometimes at work while I was reviewing client files, sometimes at home while I was cooking dinner or watching television, sometimes in public places, like the grocery store or gas station where I'd have to excuse myself to the restroom until the worst symptoms passed. Each episode left me feeling drained and vulnerable, like I'd survived some kind of physical assault that had left no visible marks but had damaged something essential inside me. I started avoiding situations that might trigger attacks. I stopped going to restaurants alone, worried that I might have an episode in public and embarrass myself. I declined Eleanor's invitations to join her for lunch or after-work social gatherings, claiming I was too busy with client projects to spare the time. I even started shopping at different hours, choosing early morning or late evening when stores were less crowded and I was less likely to feel trapped or overwhelmed by other people's presence. The isolation was feeding on itself, creating a cycle where my anxiety about having panic attacks in public made me avoid public situations, which increased my loneliness and stress, which made panic attacks more frequent and intense. I was disappearing from my own life piece by piece, withdrawing from connections and activities that had once brought me joy and purpose. Work became increasingly difficult to manage. The analytical thinking that had always been my strength felt fragmented and unreliable. I'd start reviewing a client's financial records and find myself unable to concentrate on the numbers, my mind wandering to worst-case scenarios about my health, my future, my relationship with Marcus. Eleanor noticed my declining performance but attributed it to temporary stress, offering to redistribute some of my workload until I felt more like myself. But I didn't feel like myself anymore. I felt like I was inhabiting someone else's life, going through the motions of daily existence while something vital inside me withered away. The woman who had confidently researched investment opportunities and built a substantial portfolio seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. The mother who had raised a successful son through determination and sacrifice felt like a character from a story I'd read but hadn't actually lived. 3 months after the first panic attack, I had what I can only describe as a complete breakdown. It happened on a Sunday evening while I was sitting in the kitchen paying bills, a routine task that had never caused me any stress before. As I wrote out checks for utilities and credit card payments, I suddenly felt overwhelmed by the futility of it all. What was the point of maintaining a home that no one visited? Why was I paying for cable television I barely watched, for internet? Service I used only for work, for a landline phone that never rang with calls I wanted to receive? The thoughts spiraled quickly from practical concerns to existential despair. What was the point of continuing to work and save and plan for a future that seemed increasingly empty and meaningless? What was the purpose of taking care of my health and maintaining my home and managing my investments when I had no one to share any of it with? Marcus had made it clear that I was no longer welcome in his life in any meaningful way, and I had no other family, no close friends, no romantic relationships that might provide connection and purpose. I found myself sobbing at the kitchen table, not the quiet tears of grief, but the desperate wailing of someone who felt completely lost and alone in the world. The sound coming from my own throat frightened me with its intensity, but I couldn't seem to stop. All the sadness and disappointment and loneliness I'd been pushing down for months erupted in a torrent of emotion that left me gasping and exhausted. When the crying finally subsided, I felt hollow, emptied of everything that had once made me feel human. I looked around the kitchen where Marcus and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations, where I'd helped him with homework and listened to his dreams and celebrated his achievements, and all I could see was the ghost of a relationship that no longer existed. That's when I called Marcus for the first time in 6 weeks. It was nearly 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, not an appropriate time to phone anyone, but I was beyond caring about social conventions. I needed to hear my son's voice, needed some confirmation that I still mattered to someone in the world, needed to know that the most important relationship of my life hadn't completely disintegrated. Marcus answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Mom? What's wrong? Why are you calling so late?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice still shaky from crying. "I know it's late, but I needed to talk to you." "Is everything okay? Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" The concern in his voice, even filtered through annoyance at being woken up, gave me hope that maybe he still cared about me in some fundamental way. "I'm not hurt physically," I said. "But Marcus, I'm struggling. I've been having panic attacks and I feel so alone, and I miss you so much." There was a pause, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice had shifted from concern to something more guarded. "Mom, what kind of panic attacks? Are you seeing a doctor about this?" "I haven't seen anyone yet. I keep thinking it will get better on its own, but it's been months now, and I feel like I'm falling apart." "Months?" Marcus's tone sharpened. "You've been having panic attacks for months and you haven't sought medical attention? Mom, that's not rational behavior." Rational behavior. Even in my darkest moment when I was reaching out for help and connection. Marcus was evaluating my choices rather than offering comfort. "I was hoping it would resolve itself," I said weakly. "Mental health issues don't just resolve themselves," Marcus said, slipping into what I recognized as his professional attorney voice, the tone he used when explaining obvious facts to clients who weren't thinking clearly. "You need to see a psychiatrist, get properly evaluated, maybe start taking medication." "Marcus, I don't need medical advice right now. I need my son. I need to know that you still care about me, that our relationship still means something to you." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course I care about you, Mom. But what you're describing sounds like a serious mental health crisis, and I'm not qualified to provide the kind of help you need." "I'm not asking you to provide therapy. I'm asking you to be present in my life, to call me occasionally, to treat me like I matter to you." "You do matter to me," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just that right now, with everything happening at work and the partnership track requirements, I don't have the bandwidth to manage family crises." Manage family crises. That's what I had become to him, a crisis to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. "Marcus, I'm not asking you to manage anything. I'm asking you to love me." "I do love you," he said quickly, reflexively. the way people say bless you when someone sneezes. But love means wanting what's best for someone. And what's best for you right now is professional help, not emotional dependence on me. Emotional dependence. As if wanting a relationship with my own son was some kind of psychological weakness rather than a natural human need. When did I become a burden to you? I asked. You're not a burden, Marcus said, but he said it too quickly, like he was reciting a script. You're my mother, and I want you to be healthy and happy. But I can't be responsible for your emotional well-being. That's not fair to either of us. Fair to either of us. As if 25 years of unconditional love and support had created some kind of debt that he was no longer willing to honor. As if the foundation I'd provided for his success was now being characterized as an inappropriate emotional burden. I see, I said quietly. Mom, I really think you should call a doctor tomorrow. Get a referral to a mental health professional, maybe start therapy or medication. There are effective treatments for anxiety and depression. Is that what you think this is? Mental illness? I think you're going through something that requires professional intervention, Marcus said carefully. And I think trying to rely on family relationships to solve mental health problems isn't healthy for anyone involved. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen until the sun came up, trying to process what had just happened. My son, the person I loved most in the world, had essentially told me that my need for connection with him was a symptom of mental illness, rather than a natural response to being abandoned by the most important person in my life. He'd managed to reframe my loneliness and grief as psychological dysfunction while completely avoiding any acknowledgement of his role in creating the situation. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching psychiatrists and therapists, not because I believed Marcus was right about my mental health, but because I was desperate enough to try anything that might restore some sense of purpose and stability to my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son's rejection was driving me to seek professional help for the emotional damage caused by his rejection. Dr. Sandra Reeves was a psychiatrist in her 50s who specialized in anxiety disorders and depression in middle-aged women. Her office was warm and welcoming, decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture that made it feel more like a friend's living room than a medical facility. During our first appointment, she listened patiently as I tried to explain what I'd been experiencing, though I found myself editing the story to focus on symptoms rather than causes. Tell me about your support system, Dr. Reeves said after. I described the panic attacks and insomnia and general sense of despair. Family, friends, romantic relationships, social connections. I hesitated, not wanting to admit how isolated I'd become. I have a son, I said. He's very successful, but he's busy with his career. Are you close to him? We used to be, I said carefully. Things have become more complicated as he's gotten older. Complicated how? I found myself reluctant to describe Marcus's behavior honestly, partly because I didn't want to seem like a complaining mother, and partly because saying it out loud would make it feel more real and final. He's just very focused on his professional life right now, I said. We don't talk as much as we used to. Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. It's common for adult children to become more independent as they establish their careers and identities, but major changes in family relationships can be a significant source of stress, especially for parents who have been very involved in their children's lives. Over the following weeks, Dr. Reeves helped me understand that my panic attacks and depression were symptoms of grief, specifically grief for the loss of my relationship with Marcus and the identity I'd built around being his mother. She prescribed medication to help with the anxiety and suggested therapy techniques for managing the symptoms, but she also encouraged me to look honestly at the circumstances that had triggered my mental health crisis. Hazel, she said during one of our sessions, you've described a pattern where your son has gradually distanced himself from you, excluded you from important events, and dismissed your emotional needs. Those are significant relationship issues that would affect anyone's mental health. But Marcus says I'm being emotionally dependent, that I should be able to manage my own well-being without relying on family relationships. Independence is important, Dr. Reeves agreed. But humans are social creatures. We need connections, especially with the people we love most. Wanting a meaningful relationship with your adult child isn't emotional dependence, it's normal attachment. The validation was both comforting and painful. Comforting because it confirmed that my reactions weren't entirely irrational. Painful because it forced me to acknowledge that Marcus's treatment of me was genuinely harmful, rather than just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with better communication. As my mental health gradually stabilized with medication and therapy, I began to see my situation more clearly. Marcus hadn't just become busy or independent, he had actively excluded me from his life because he was ashamed of me. He'd rewritten our family history to minimize my role in his success, and when I'd tried to maintain our connection, he'd characterized my efforts as psychological dysfunction rather than legitimate emotional needs. The clarity was devastating but also oddly liberating. For months, I'd been trying to fix a relationship that Marcus had no interest in maintaining. I'd been accepting crumbs of attention and affection while pretending that his coldness was temporary or justified by career pressures. I'd been making excuses for behavior that was simply inexcusable. Dr. Reeves suggested that I might benefit from a more intensive treatment program, not because my symptoms were severe, but because the underlying issues were complex and would benefit from focused attention. Meadowview Psychiatric Center offered a 3-week residential program that combined individual therapy, group sessions, medication management, and lifestyle interventions designed to help people rebuild their lives after major emotional trauma. The idea of checking myself into a psychiatric facility felt both frightening and appealing. Frightening because it represented an acknowledgement that my mental health had deteriorated to the point where professional intervention was necessary. Appealing because it offered the possibility of healing in an environment where I wouldn't have to pretend that everything was fine while struggling to get through each day. When I called Marcus to tell him about the treatment program, his response was exactly what I'd come to expect from him. Relief that I was taking his advice about seeking professional help, combined with complete disinterest in providing any emotional support during what would be a challenging experience. "That sounds like a good plan, Mom," he said when I explained the program. 3 weeks should give you time to really focus on getting better. "I was hoping you might visit while I'm there," I said, knowing it was unlikely but needing to ask anyway. "We'll see how things go," Marcus said vaguely. "The important thing is that you concentrate on your recovery without worrying about outside obligations." Outside obligations. That's what I had become to him, an outside obligation rather than a central relationship. Even my mental health treatment was being framed as something that should happen without his involvement or support. The night before I checked into Meadowview, I sat in the duplex that had been our family home for so many years, looking at photo albums and remembering when Marcus and I had been genuinely close. There were pictures of birthday parties and holiday celebrations, school events and family vacations, ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. I packed a small suitcase with clothes and personal items that would sustain me through 3 weeks of intensive therapy. But I also packed something else that I hoped might help me remember who I'd been before my identity became entirely dependent on my relationship with Marcus. I packed my investment portfolio statements, the documentation of wealth I'd built through my own intelligence and determination, the proof that I was more than just a struggling single mother who'd become an embarrassment to her successful son. Those papers represented something Marcus had never bothered to learn about me. They told a story of financial acumen and strategic thinking that would have impressed anyone who took the time to understand what I'd accomplished. They were evidence of a woman who deserved respect and recognition, not shame and abandonment. I had no idea that those same papers would soon become the foundation for teaching Marcus the most expensive lesson of his life about the true cost of treating family like an inconvenience rather than a treasure. But that revelation was still weeks away, waiting for the moment when my recovery would collide with his assumptions in ways that would change both our lives forever. The 3 weeks at Meadowview Psychiatric Center transformed me in ways I hadn't expected. Not because the therapy was revolutionary or the medication was life-changing, but because being surrounded by other people who were struggling with their own emotional crises helped me see my situation with startling clarity. In group sessions, listening to stories of family rejection, professional disappointment, and personal loss, I began to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't mental illness in the traditional sense. It was a rational response to an irrational situation. There was Margaret, a 60-year-old teacher whose adult children had stopped speaking to her after she refused to take out a second mortgage to fund their various business ventures. There was Linda, a successful real estate agent whose husband had left her for a younger woman and whose friends had chosen sides in the divorce. There was Patricia, a retired nurse whose family treated her like an unpaid babysitter and maid, expected to be available for their convenience while receiving no consideration for her own needs or desires. All of us were women who had given everything to the people we loved, only to find ourselves discarded when we were no longer useful or when our needs became inconvenient. All of us had been told, directly or indirectly, that our pain was somehow our fault, that we were being too sensitive or too demanding or too emotionally dependent. Dr. Martinez, who led our group sessions, had a way of cutting through the self-blame and getting to the heart of dysfunctional family dynamics. Healthy relationships require reciprocity, she would say. When one person gives everything and the other person takes everything, that's not love. That's exploitation. The word exploitation hit me like a physical blow the first time she said it. I'd spent 25 years thinking of my relationship with Marcus as one-sided sacrifice for the greater good of his success and happiness. But Dr. Martinez was suggesting that Marcus had been taking advantage of my willingness to give without expecting anything in return, and that his current behavior was the logical extension of a pattern that had been developing for years. Hazel, she said during one of our sessions, you've described a relationship where you provided financial support, emotional support, and unconditional love while asking for very little in return. And now that you're asking for basic respect and acknowledgement, you're being told that your needs are inappropriate. Does that sound like a healthy dynamic to you? When she put it that way, the answer was obvious. But admitting it meant acknowledging that the relationship I'd treasured most in my life was fundamentally unbalanced and possibly unsalvageable. It meant accepting that Marcus might never be capable of loving me the way I'd loved him, with genuine care for my well-being rather than just appreciation for what I could provide. The revelation was both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it meant grieving not just the current state of our relationship, but the illusion that it had ever been as meaningful to him as it was to me. Liberating, because it freed me from the responsibility of fixing something that I hadn't broken and couldn't repair. Dr. Reeves, in our individual sessions, helped me explore what my life might look like if I stopped organizing it around Marcus's approval and started building it around my own values and interests. What did you enjoy before you became a mother? She asked. What brought you satisfaction independent of your role in Marcus's life? The question stumped me initially because I'd been Marcus's mother for so long that I couldn't easily remember who I'd been before that identity consumed everything else. But gradually, with her encouragement, I began to recall interests and ambitions I'd set aside to focus on raising him. I'd enjoyed analyzing financial markets and had been good at it. I'd liked solving complex problems and had found satisfaction in helping Eleanor's other clients organize their finances and plan for retirement. Have you ever considered starting your own financial planning practice? Dr. Reeves asked during one of our sessions. The idea hadn't occurred to me, but once she planted it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had decades of experience, a proven track record of successful investing, and a substantial portfolio that demonstrated my expertise. I also had something many financial advisors lacked: personal experience with the challenges of building wealth from nothing, supporting a family on a limited income, and making smart decisions under pressure. For the first time in months, I felt excited about something that had nothing to do with Marcus or our relationship. I started researching the requirements for becoming a licensed financial advisor, looking into continuing education programs, and imagining what it would feel like to build a business around helping other people achieve financial security and independence. The other revelation that emerged during my time at Meadowview was just how much wealth I'd actually accumulated over the years. I'd been so focused on Marcus's education expenses and future needs that I hadn't paid close attention to the total value of my various investments. When I finally calculated everything, including the growth in my retirement accounts, the appreciation in my real estate investments, and the current value of my stock portfolio, the number was staggering. I was worth just over $4 million. The realization hit me during a quiet moment in my room at the facility as I was reviewing financial statements that I'd brought with me for therapeutic purposes. Dr. Reeves had suggested that reconnecting with my achievements and capabilities might help rebuild my self-esteem, and she'd encouraged me to look at concrete evidence of my successes rather than focusing on my perceived failures as a mother. But I hadn't expected to discover that my careful investing and strategic planning had made me genuinely wealthy. Not just comfortable or secure, but wealthy enough to live however I chose, to start any kind of business I wanted, to make decisions based on my own preferences rather than financial constraints. The irony was almost laughable. Marcus had been treating me like an embarrassing burden, someone whose modest lifestyle and working-class background reflected poorly on his professional image. Meanwhile, I had been quietly building a fortune that dwarfed his lawyer's salary and would have impressed anyone who knew about it. But Marcus didn't know about it because he'd never bothered to ask about my finances, my investments, or my plans for the future. He'd made assumptions based on appearances and never looked deeper to understand the reality of my situation. He'd written me off as a struggling single mother who'd done her best, but would probably need his financial support in her old age, never imagining that I was actually better positioned financially than he was. The knowledge was empowering in ways I hadn't anticipated, not because of the money itself, but because it proved that I was capable of much more than Marcus gave me credit for. I wasn't just a devoted mother who'd sacrificed everything for her son's success. I was a shrewd investor who'd built substantial wealth through intelligence and discipline. I was a woman who'd succeeded in areas where Marcus himself was still struggling, despite his expensive education and prestigious job. During my final week at Meadowview, I made several decisions that would reshape my life completely. First, I would not be returning to the accounting firm. Eleanor had been understanding about my need for treatment, but I was ready for something bigger than processing other people's financial records. I was going to start my own financial planning practice, focusing on helping women build wealth and security for themselves and their families. Second, I would not be continuing to live in the duplex where every room held memories of happier times with Marcus. I was going to sell it and buy something that reflected my actual financial situation, rather than the image of modest struggle that I'd maintained for so long. Not something ostentatious or showy, but something that felt worthy of the woman I'd become rather than the woman I'd been pretending to be. Third, and most importantly, I was done begging for Marcus's attention and approval. I was done making excuses for his behavior and accepting crumbs of affection while pretending they constituted a meaningful relationship. If he wanted to be part of my life, he would need to treat me with the respect and consideration that any caring adult child shows their parent. If he couldn't or wouldn't do that, then our relationship would be entirely on my terms. The decision felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Terrifying because it meant accepting that I might lose the last connection to the person I'd loved most in the world. Exhilarating because it meant reclaiming my dignity and self-worth after months of feeling worthless and disposable. On my last day at Meadowview, Dr. Martinez pulled me aside after our final group session. Hazel, she said, I want you to remember something. The way Marcus has been treating you says nothing about your worth as a person or as a mother. It says everything. About his character and his values. You raised him to be successful, but you didn't raise him to be cruel. That's a choice he's made as an adult, and it's not your responsibility to fix or excuse. Her words resonated deeply because they acknowledged something I'd been struggling to accept. I had given Marcus every advantage, every opportunity, every foundation for success that a mother could provide. But I hadn't been able to give him empathy, kindness, or loyalty. Those were qualities he would have had to develop himself, and apparently he'd chosen not to. The ride home from Meadowview should have been depressing, returning to the same duplex and the same life that had been the source of so much pain. Instead, I felt energized and purposeful in ways I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't returning to my old life. I was beginning a new one. The first thing I did when I got home was call a real estate agent about listing the duplex. The second thing I did was research office space for rent in the better part of town, locations that would be appropriate for a financial planning practice serving affluent clients. The third thing I did was start designing business cards and letterhead for Norton Financial Services, the company I was going to build around helping people achieve the kind of financial independence I'd created for myself. Marcus called 2 days after my discharge, his first contact since the night I'd reached out to him in desperation 3 weeks earlier. His tone was polite but distant, the way he might speak to a client whose case had been resolved satisfactorily. "Mom, how are you feeling? The treatment was helpful, I hope." "Very helpful," I said, surprised by how calm and centered I sounded. "I learned a lot about myself and my situation." "That's great. I'm glad you're feeling better." "I am feeling better. Much better. In fact, I'm making some major changes in my life." There was a pause, and when Marcus spoke again, I could hear wariness in his voice. "What kind of changes?" "I'm starting my own business, financial planning and investment services. I'm also selling the duplex and buying something more suitable for my current circumstances." "Your current circumstances?" Marcus sounded confused. "Mom, are you sure you're thinking clearly? Starting a business is a big risk, and selling the house. Where would you live?" "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I said. "And I'm not worried about the risks. I have substantial resources to draw on." "Resources?" Marcus's confusion was evident. "Mom, I know you've been careful with money, but starting a business requires significant capital. Maybe you should think about this more carefully." "Marcus," I said, feeling a calm satisfaction that surprised me, "I don't think you understand my financial situation as well as you think you do." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the modest lifestyle you've been so embarrassed by was a choice, not a necessity. I mean that while you've been building your legal career, I've been building something quite different." "I don't understand what you're talking about." "I know you don't," I said. "That's exactly the problem." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his attorney instincts seemed to be kicking in. "Mom, if you're talking about some kind of inheritance or windfall that I don't know about, I think we should discuss it. Major financial decisions shouldn't be made impulsively, especially after a psychiatric hospitalization." Psychiatric hospitalization. He was using my mental health treatment as evidence that I couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about my own life. The irony was stunning, given that my mental health crisis had been largely caused by his treatment of me, and my recovery had involved recognizing exactly how capable and successful I actually was. "There's no inheritance, Marcus. There's no windfall. There's just 25 years of careful planning and smart investing that you never bothered to ask about." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your assumptions about me, about my financial situation, about my capabilities, have been completely wrong. And I'm saying that I'm done allowing those assumptions to define our relationship. Mom, I think we should meet in person to discuss this." You sound different. I am different. 3 weeks of therapy taught me to recognize my own worth instead of depending on other people to validate it. That's good, Marcus said carefully. But I'm concerned about these business plans and talk about substantial resources. Maybe we could meet for lunch this weekend and you could show me what you're thinking about? For the first time in our conversation, I heard genuine interest in his voice. Not concern for my well-being, but curiosity about what I'd meant by substantial resources. The prospect of money, or at least the prospect that I might have money, had captured his attention in a way that my emotional needs never had. I don't think so, Marcus. I don't think you're ready for that conversation yet. Ready for what conversation? The conversation where you learn who I really am, instead of who you've decided I am. The conversation where you discover what I've actually accomplished instead of what you've assumed I've accomplished. The conversation where you realize that the mother you've been ashamed of has been more successful than you imagined. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that I'd never heard before. Mom, are you saying you have more money than I realized? I'm saying that everything you think you know about me is wrong. I'm saying that your assumptions about my limitations have been limiting you, not me. And I'm saying that if you want to have a relationship with me going forward, it's going to be on very different terms than it's been. What kind of terms? The kind where you treat me with respect. The kind where you acknowledge what I've contributed to your success instead of being embarrassed by it. The kind where you show up as my son instead of managing me like a problem that needs to be solved. I've never managed you like a problem, Marcus said, but his protest lacked conviction. Marcus, when I called you in crisis 3 weeks ago, your response was to tell me to seek professional help and stop being emotionally dependent on you. When I told you I was going into treatment, your response was relief that you wouldn't have to deal with my needs. When I asked you to visit me during the most difficult time of my life, you said you didn't have the bandwidth for family crises. If that's not managing me like a problem, what would you call it? Marcus was quiet again, and I could almost hear him processing what I'd said, trying to formulate a response that would minimize his role in my suffering without actually acknowledging responsibility for it. I was trying to encourage you to get the help you needed, he said finally. You were trying to avoid dealing with the pain you'd caused. That's not fair, Mom. I didn't cause your mental health issues. Didn't you? I asked quietly. Marcus, do you think it's a coincidence that my panic attack started right around the time you began treating me like an embarrassment? Do you think it's random that my depression coincided with your decision to exclude me from your life? Mental health is complicated, Marcus said, falling back on the clinical language he'd used throughout my crisis. There are usually multiple factors involved. You're right, I agreed. There are multiple factors. But the biggest factor was losing the relationship that had been the center of my life for 25 years. The biggest factor was being rejected by the person I loved most in the world. I didn't reject you. You absolutely rejected me. You refused to acknowledge me as your mother in front of your colleagues. You excluded me from important events in your life. You treated my love and interest as burdens to be managed rather than gifts to be treasured. That's rejection, Marcus. That's abandonment. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus alternately defending his behavior and expressing vague concern about my mental state. But I could hear something new in his voice, a note of uncertainty that suggested my words were having an impact. For the first time, he seemed to be questioning his assumptions about our relationship and his role in my emotional crisis. When we finally hung up, I felt both drained and energized. Drained from the emotional intensity of confronting Marcus with the truth about his behavior. Energized by the realization that I was no longer willing to accept his version of our relationship, or his characterization of my needs as inappropriate. Over the following days, I threw myself into planning my new life with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. I toured office spaces and found a beautiful suite in a professional building near the city's financial district. I met with attorneys about incorporating Norton Financial Services and began the process of obtaining the licenses and certifications I would need to operate as an independent financial advisor. Most importantly, I started reaching out to other women who might benefit from financial planning services tailored to their specific needs and circumstances. Women who were divorced and trying to rebuild their financial security. Women who were approaching retirement and wanted to ensure their independence. Women who were building wealth for the first time and needed guidance about investment strategies and risk management. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Apparently, there was a significant market for financial services provided by someone who understood the unique challenges facing women, especially women who had been overlooked or underestimated by traditional financial institutions. Within 2 weeks, I had a waiting list of potential clients and the beginnings of what I knew would be a very successful business. The real estate market was also working in my favor. The duplex sold within a week of being listed for significantly more than I'd expected. The buyers were a young couple with a baby who fell in love with the neighborhood and the history of the house. As I signed the closing papers, I felt like I was literally closing the door on one chapter of my life and opening another. My new home was an elegant townhouse in an upscale neighborhood. Nothing ostentatious, but definitely a reflection of my actual financial status, rather than the modest image I'd maintained for so long. It had a home office where I could meet with clients, a modern kitchen where I could entertain if I chose to, and a master suite that felt like a retreat from the world rather than a place to hide from it. Marcus called again the week I moved into the townhouse, and I could hear genuine confusion in his voice when I gave him my new address. "Mom, this is a very expensive neighborhood. How are you affording this?" "The same way I afforded your education," I said, "through careful planning and smart financial decisions. But your job at the accounting firm was just one source of income, Marcus, not my only source of income." "I don't understand. What other sources of income do you have?" "Investment returns, primarily. Returns on a portfolio I've been building for over 20 years. "What kind of portfolio?" "The kind that's made me financially independent. The kind that's allowed me to support your education and start my own business and buy a home that reflects my actual circumstances, rather than your assumptions about them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, are you telling me you're wealthy?" "I'm telling you that I'm not the struggling single mother you've been pretending I am. I'm telling you that the modest lifestyle you've been embarrassed by was a choice, not a limitation. I'm telling you that your assumptions about me have been completely wrong." "How wrong?" "Wrong enough that you should probably rethink everything you thought you knew about our family situation." "Mom, I think we need to meet. I think we need to have a serious conversation about all of this." "Do we?" I asked. "Because for the past 6 months, you've made it very clear that you don't have time for serious conversations with me. You've made it clear that my presence in your life is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished." "That's not... I was just trying to establish appropriate boundaries." "Appropriate boundaries don't include refusing to acknowledge your mother's existence. Appropriate boundaries don't include treating her emotional needs as psychological dysfunction. Appropriate boundaries don't include abandoning her during a mental health crisis." "I didn't abandon you. I encouraged you to get professional help." "You encouraged me to get professional help so you wouldn't have to deal with me. There's a difference." Marcus was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of something I'd never heard from him before. Not quite humility, but something approaching uncertainty about his own judgment. "Mom, I think I may have mishandled some things. I think maybe we should talk about how to move forward." "I think maybe we should," I agreed. "But Marcus, if we're going to talk, it's going to be an honest conversation. It's going to be a conversation where you acknowledge the impact of your behavior instead of justifying it. It's going to be a conversation where you show up as my son instead of as my case manager. I can do that, Marcus said, though he didn't sound entirely certain. We'll see, I said. We'll see if you're ready to discover who your mother really is instead of who you've decided she is. We'll see if you're ready to apologize for your behavior instead of explaining it away. We'll see if you're ready to be part of my life instead of managing it from a distance. When do you want to meet? I don't, I said, surprising both of us. I want you to think about this conversation for a while. I want you to consider whether you're actually ready to change the way you relate to me, or whether you're just curious about my financial situation. I want you to decide whether you want a relationship with me or whether you just want access to whatever resources you think I might have. I'm not. Marcus, for the first time in months, you've shown sustained interest in a conversation with me. But that interest only emerged when I mentioned having substantial resources. I find the timing very telling. Mom, that's not fair. I'm concerned about you. Are you? Or are you concerned about what my new financial status might mean for you? Marcus didn't answer immediately, and his silence told me everything I needed to know. The son who had been too busy to visit me during my psychiatric treatment, too overwhelmed to provide emotional support during my crisis, too professional to acknowledge me as his mother in front of his colleagues, suddenly had time for lengthy phone calls and urgent requests for meetings now that money was involved. Think about it, Marcus, I said before ending the call. Think about what kind of son you want to be and what kind of relationship you want to have with me. Think about whether you're ready to treat me with the respect I deserve or whether you're just interested in what I might be able to provide for you. Think about it carefully, because the next time we talk, I'm going to expect some very honest answers. After I hung up, I sat in my new home office, looking out at the garden that came with my townhouse, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not just the absence of anxiety or depression, but genuine peace that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth, independent of anyone else's opinion or validation. Marcus would either rise to the occasion and become the son I'd raised him to be, or he would reveal himself to be exactly the kind of person his recent behavior suggested he'd become. Either way, I was finally free from the burden of trying to earn love and respect from someone who might not be capable of giving either. The woman who had been abandoned at the mental health facility was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own value and wouldn't accept anything less than what she deserved. The question now was whether Marcus was smart enough to recognize the gift he'd been given in having me as his mother, or whether he would continue to see me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a treasure to cherish. Either way, I was finally ready to find out. Part 5. The Reckoning. 2 weeks passed before Marcus called again, and when he did, I could hear something different in his voice. Not quite humility, but a careful restraint that suggested he'd been thinking seriously about our last conversation. He asked if we could meet for lunch, somewhere quiet where we could talk without interruption. His tone was respectful, almost formal, like he was addressing a client whose business he needed to retain. I agreed to meet him at a restaurant downtown, a place I'd never been to, but that I knew was expensive and sophisticated, the kind of establishment where Marcus felt comfortable with his professional colleagues. I arrived 15 minutes early and requested a table in a quiet corner where we could speak privately. When Marcus walked in, dressed in one of his expensive suits and carrying the leather briefcase that had become part of his professional armor, I watched him scan the dining room with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating social environments. He spotted me and walked over with the confident stride I'd watched him develop over the years, but when he reached the table, something in his expression shifted. Maybe it was the way I was dressed, in a tailored blazer and silk blouse that suggested success rather than struggle. Maybe it was the way I carried myself, with a confidence that hadn't been there during our previous encounters. Or maybe it was simply that he was seeing me in an environment that didn't fit his assumptions about my social and economic status. "Mom," he said, leaning down to give me the kind of brief, formal hug that colleagues might exchange. "You look different." "I feel different," I said, gesturing for him to sit across from me. "The last few weeks have been very revealing." Marcus settled into his chair and immediately reached for the wine list, a gesture that seemed designed to establish his sophistication and control over the situation. "Should we order a bottle of wine? They have an excellent selection here." "I'll have a glass of the Chardonnay," I said, choosing something modest but not cheap. "You order whatever you'd like." He signaled the waiter and ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week, clearly intending to demonstrate his financial success and adult sophistication. When the waiter left, Marcus looked at me with an expression that seemed to combine curiosity, caution, and something that might have been nervousness. "Mom, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I realize there are some things I don't understand about your situation." "What kinds of things?" "Well, this restaurant, for instance, it's not exactly budget-friendly. And your new address, your talk about starting a business, your comments about having substantial resources, it's all very different from what I expected." I took a sip of my water and studied my son's face, noting the way his eyes kept darting around the dining room as if he was concerned about being overheard. "What did you expect, Marcus?" "I don't know. I guess I thought you were living paycheck to paycheck, maybe struggling a bit since you're getting older. I thought the duplex was probably all you could afford, and that your job at the accounting firm was, well, just a job to pay the bills." "And why did you think that?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't know. I guess because you never talked about having money, and you always lived so modestly. You drove that old car for years. You never traveled anywhere exciting. You never bought expensive clothes or jewelry. I just assumed." "You assumed that modest living meant limited resources." "Well, yes, doesn't it usually?" I smiled, feeling a calm satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. "Not always, Marcus. Sometimes modest living means priorities that you might not understand." The waiter returned with our wine, and Marcus went through the ritual of tasting and approving it with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was stalling for time while trying to process what I'd just said. When we were alone again, he leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. "Mom, I need to ask you directly. Do you have money? Significant money? Define significant." "I don't know. More than I realized. More than would be typical for someone with your background." "My background," I repeated. "You mean someone who worked at a small accounting firm and raised a son as a single mother?" "Yes, that background." I opened my purse and pulled out a manila folder that I'd brought specifically for this conversation. Inside were copies of my most recent investment statements, property valuations, and business incorporation documents. I placed the folder on the table between us but didn't open it. "Marcus, before I answer your question, I want you to answer mine. Over the past 6 months, you've treated me like an embarrassment, excluded me from important events in your life, refused to acknowledge me as your mother in professional settings, and dismissed my emotional needs as psychological dysfunction. Why do you think my financial situation is relevant to our relationship?" Marcus glanced at the folder and then back at my face, clearly torn between curiosity about its contents and awareness that he was walking into some kind of trap. "I don't think it's relevant to our relationship. I'm just trying to understand your circumstances so I can be supportive." "Supportive how?" "I don't know. Maybe help you make good decisions about your future, provide advice about investments or retirement planning. I have experience with financial matters through my work. And if I don't have significant money? If I'm just the struggling single mother you assumed I was? Would you still want to be supportive?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't reveal the calculation behind his sudden interest in my well-being. Of course I would. You're my mother. Am I? I asked quietly. Because for the past 6 months, you've acted like I'm a distant relative whose presence in your life is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished. That's not... I was just trying to establish healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries don't include refusing to acknowledge your mother's existence. Healthy boundaries don't include abandoning her during a mental health crisis. Healthy boundaries don't include treating her love and support as burdens to be shed rather than gifts to be treasured. Marcus took a large sip of his wine and looked around the restaurant again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. Mom, I think maybe I handled some things poorly. I was under a lot of pressure at work, and maybe I overcorrected in trying to separate my personal and professional lives. Overcorrected, I repeated. Is that what you call it when you introduced me by my first name at your firm's reception? When you told your colleagues I was just someone who kept you sane? Marcus winced slightly at the reminder. I was nervous. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were ashamed. You were ashamed of me, of our history together, of the foundation that made your success possible. That's not true, isn't it? I opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a summary statement I'd prepared that showed the total value of my investment portfolio. I placed it on the table in front of Marcus and watched his face as he read the number at the bottom. His reaction was everything I'd expected and more. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, and he looked up at me with an expression of complete shock. This says you're worth over $1.4 million. That's correct. But how? When? I don't understand. 28 years of careful investing, Marcus. 28 years of living below my means so I could build something substantial. 28 years of research and strategic planning and taking calculated risks that have paid off handsomely. Marcus stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. But you worked at an accounting firm. You lived in a duplex. You drove that old Honda for years. All true, and completely irrelevant to my investment activities. Investment activities? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Mom, you're talking like you're some kind of professional investor. I am some kind of professional investor. That's exactly what I am. I pulled out additional documents from the folder, records of stock purchases and sales, real estate investment returns, dividend payments, and compound growth calculations that painted a picture of sophisticated financial management spanning decades. Marcus flipped through the papers with growing amazement and what looked like genuine confusion. I had no idea, he said finally. I never knew you were doing any of this. You never asked. In all the years we've known each other, you've never once asked me about my financial plans, my investment strategy, or my long-term goals. You made assumptions based on appearances and never looked deeper. But why didn't you tell me? Why? Did you keep it secret? I didn't keep it secret, Marcus. I just didn't volunteer information that you never seemed interested in hearing. Every time we talked, you focused on your own achievements, your own challenges, your own goals. You never asked about mine. Marcus set down the papers and leaned back in his chair, looking like he needed time to process what he'd learned. This changes everything. Does it? Does my net worth change the way you feel about me as a person? Does it change whether you're proud to be my son? Does it change whether you want me in your life? Of course not. It's just, this explains so much. How you could afford my education, how you're starting your own business, how you bought that townhouse. I thought maybe you'd gotten into debt or made some kind of risky financial decision. You thought I was irresponsible with money because you assumed I didn't have any money to be responsible with. I guess so, yes. I pulled out another document, this one showing the education expenses I'd covered for Marcus over the years. Private high school tuition, college costs, law school expenses, living allowances, and miscellaneous support that totaled well over $300,000. Do these numbers look familiar to you? Marcus studied the breakdown and nodded slowly. These are my school costs, all of them. Every penny, paid from my investment returns without touching my principal or taking on any debt. But I assumed you'd taken out loans or used savings or maybe gotten financial aid. No loans, no financial aid, just strategic liquidation of appreciated assets to fund your education while maintaining the growth trajectory of my overall portfolio. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents spread across our table. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed in ways I couldn't quite interpret. "Mom, I owe you an apology. Several apologies." "For what, specifically?" "For assuming you were financially unsophisticated, for thinking your lifestyle reflected limited resources, rather than deliberate choices, for not asking about your situation instead of making assumptions." "Those are good starts," I said, "but they're not the apologies I need most." "What do you need me to apologize for?" "For being ashamed of me. For treating me like an embarrassment instead of celebrating the woman who made your success possible. For excluding me from your life when you decided I didn't fit the image you wanted to project." Marcus winced again. "I wasn't ashamed of you." "You absolutely were ashamed of me. You refused to acknowledge me as your mother in front of your colleagues. You excluded me from professional events. You created distance between us because you thought my background reflected poorly on your professional image. Maybe I was concerned about perceptions, but you were ashamed," I said firmly. "And that shame had nothing to do with my actual circumstances and everything to do with your assumptions about what those circumstances meant." Marcus took another large sip of wine and nodded reluctantly. "You're right. I was ashamed, and I was wrong to be ashamed. I should have been proud of you regardless of your financial situation. But you weren't proud of me regardless of my financial situation. You're only reconsidering your attitude now that you know I'm wealthy. That's not fair. Isn't it? Marcus, for the past hour, you've shown more interest in my life and more respect for my intelligence than you've shown in the past 6 months combined. The only thing that's changed is your knowledge of my net worth." Marcus was quiet again, and I could see him struggling with the implications of what I'd said. He'd spent months treating me like a burden to be managed, and now he was learning that the burden was actually more successful than he was. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to decide what kind of son you want to be. I want you to decide whether you're capable of loving and respecting me for who I am rather than what I can provide for you. I want you to decide whether you want a genuine relationship with me or whether you just want access to my resources. I want a genuine relationship with you. Do you? Because your sudden interest in spending time with me coincided exactly with your discovery that I have money. That timing is very telling. Maybe the timing is coincidental. Maybe I was already reconsidering my behavior, and learning about your financial situation just gave me the push I needed to reach out." I studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated interest. Maybe. But I'm not willing to take that risk. "What do you mean?" I pulled out the final document from my folder, a legal paper that I'd had drawn up the week before. "This is a will, Marcus. My most recent will." Marcus glanced at the document but didn't reach for it. "Okay. The previous version of my will left everything to you. My entire estate, all my investments, the new townhouse, the business I'm starting, everything. You were my sole beneficiary." "Was?" "This new version leaves everything to charity. The Marcus Norton Foundation for Financial Literacy, which will provide investment education and resources to low-income single mothers who want to build wealth for themselves and their families." Marcus stared at me like I'd just announced that I was moving to Mars. "You're leaving everything to charity?" I'm leaving everything to a charity that will be named after you and will continue the work I've been doing for decades, building financial security for women who are raising children on their own, just like I did. But why? Why would you cut me out of your will? Because I want to know whether you love me for who I am or for what I can give you. I want to know whether you're proud to be my son or whether you're just interested in inheriting my wealth. This is crazy. You can't just disinherit your own son because of a few misunderstandings. They weren't misunderstandings, Marcus. They were deliberate choices you made about how to treat me. And disinheriting you isn't punishment. It's clarity. If you want a relationship with me, it will have to be because you value me as a person, not because you're hoping to benefit financially from our connection. Marcus looked genuinely panicked for the first time in our conversation. Mom, this is extreme. Can't we just agree that I made some mistakes and work on rebuilding our relationship? Does it have to involve legal documents and threats about inheritance? It's not a threat, Marcus. It's a reality. The new will is already executed and filed with my attorney. If something happened to me tomorrow, you wouldn't receive a penny of my estate. But that's not fair. I'm your son. I should inherit your wealth regardless of our relationship. And there it was. The statement that revealed everything I'd suspected about his motivations. Marcus believed he was entitled to my money simply by virtue of being my biological child, regardless of how he treated me or whether he contributed anything positive to my life. Why should you inherit my wealth regardless of our relationship? I asked. Because I'm family. Because that's how inheritance works. Parents leave their money to their children. Even children who are ashamed of their parents? Even children who exclude their parents from their lives? Even children who treat their parents like embarrassments to be hidden rather than relationships to be cherished? Marcus had no answer for that question, and his silence spoke volumes about his sense of entitlement and his assumptions about unconditional inheritance. Let me ask you something else, Marcus. If our situations were reversed, if you were wealthy, and I was struggling, and if I had treated you the way you've treated me over the past 6 months, would you still feel obligated to leave me your money? That's different. How is it different? Because you're the parent. Parents are supposed to support their children unconditionally. Support? Yes. Enable poor behavior? No. Love unconditionally? Yes. Accept mistreatment unconditionally? No. Marcus finished his wine and signaled the waiter for another bottle, clearly needing time to think about what I'd said. When we were alone again, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. Mom, what do you want me to do? How can I fix this? I want you to examine your own behavior and motivations honestly. I want you to decide whether you're capable of treating me with the respect and love that I deserve. I want you to prove that you value our relationship for its own sake, not for what you might gain from it. How do I prove that? By showing up, Marcus. By being present in my life without expecting anything in return. By acknowledging your mistakes without making excuses for them. By treating me like someone you're proud to call your mother instead of someone you're obligated to manage. And if I do those things, will you change your will back? I smiled at the question because it revealed that he still didn't understand what I was trying to teach him. Marcus, the fact that your first concern is about the will proves that you're not ready for the kind of relationship I'm describing. I'm just trying to understand the parameters. There are no parameters. There are no guarantees. There's just the choice to love me and value me for who I am, or to continue treating me like a resource to be managed and eventually inherited. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something I'd never heard from him before. Not quite humility, but something approaching genuine uncertainty about his own judgment. I think I've been a terrible son. You've made terrible choices, I corrected, but you're not inherently terrible. You're capable of better, Marcus. The question is whether you're willing to do better. I want to do better. I want to be the son you deserve. Then prove it. Not with words, but with actions. Not because you want something from me, but because you genuinely care about me as a person. How long do I have to prove it? Again, the question revealed his transactional thinking. Marcus, if you're thinking about this in terms of timelines and requirements, you're missing the point entirely. I'm just trying to understand what you expect. I expect nothing, Marcus. That's the whole point. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life hoping for crumbs of affection from someone who sees me as an obligation rather than a treasure. I'm going to build a life that makes me happy, with or without you in it. With or without me. That's your choice to make. You can choose to be part of my life in a meaningful way, or you can choose to continue treating me like an inconvenience. But if you choose the latter, you'll be doing it without any expectation of financial benefit. Marcus stared at the legal documents still spread across our table, clearly trying to process the magnitude of what he was learning. Not just about my wealth, but about the consequences of his behavior and the choices he now faced. Mom, I need time to think about all of this. Take all the time you need, I said, gathering the papers and returning them to the folder. But understand that I'm not waiting for you to decide whether I'm worth treating well. I've already decided that I'm worth treating well, and I'm going to surround myself with people who agree. What does that mean? It means I'm building a life that doesn't depend on your approval or participation. I'm starting a business that excites me, living in a home that makes me happy, and developing relationships with people who value me for who I am. If you want to be part of that life, you're welcome. But only if you can show up as someone I'm proud to call my son. Marcus reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign after months of careful distance. I want to be that person, Mom. I want to be someone you're proud of. Then be that person, Marcus. Not because of what you might inherit, but because of who you want to be. I stood up from the table and gathered my purse, leaving Marcus, sitting alone with the wine and the weight of everything he'd learned. The bill is taken care of, I said, having prearranged payment with the restaurant staff. Think about what we've discussed. Think about what kind of relationship you want to have with me, and what you're willing to give rather than what you're hoping to get. As I walked toward the exit, I heard Marcus call after me. Mom, wait. When will I see you again? I turned back to look at my son, sitting alone at the expensive restaurant table, surrounded by the remnants of a conversation that had shattered every assumption he'd made about me and our relationship. That depends entirely on you, Marcus. When you're ready to be my son instead of my heir, call me. When you're ready to love me instead of manage me, I'll be here. But I won't be waiting forever, and I won't be accepting anything less than what I deserve. 3 months later, Marcus called. Not to ask about my will or to negotiate terms for our relationship, but to apologize. Really apologize, without excuses or justifications or attempts to minimize his behavior. He acknowledged that he'd been ashamed of me, that he'd treated me poorly, and that he'd prioritized his professional image over our relationship in ways that were inexcusable. More importantly, he started showing up. He visited my new office and expressed genuine admiration for the business I was building. He attended a client appreciation event I hosted and introduced me to his girlfriend as my mother, the financial advisor who built all of this from nothing. He called regularly, not to check on my mental health or manage my decisions, but to share his life and ask about mine. The changes weren't immediate or dramatic, but they were consistent and genuine. Marcus began treating me like someone he was proud to know rather than someone he was obligated to tolerate. He started asking about my investment strategies, my business plans, my goals and dreams and opinions about things that mattered to me. 6 months after our restaurant confrontation, I revised my will again. Not because Marcus had earned his inheritance back, but because I'd seen evidence that he was capable of loving me for who I was rather than what I could provide for him. The new will still included substantial charitable giving, but it also provided for Marcus in ways that reflected both my love for him and my expectations for how he would honor that gift. But the money was never really the point. The point was teaching my son that relationships built on love and respect are more valuable than any inheritance, and that the people who truly care about you will prove it through their actions rather than their expectations. Marcus learned that lesson the hard way, but he did learn it. And in the process, we rebuilt our relationship on a foundation that was stronger than either wealth or obligation. We rebuilt it on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the understanding that love isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn every day through the choices you make about how to treat the people who matter most. The woman who'd been abandoned at the mental health facility was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't accept anything less than what she deserved. The son who'd been ashamed of his mother was gone too, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the character and values that make you worthy of being loved. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that teach us what's truly priceless. And sometimes the people who seem to have the least to offer are the ones who've been quietly building treasure all along, waiting for someone wise enough to recognize its value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.